you all for being here. Just a quick reminder to everyone, we're going to be doing questions in the chat. And if you are not the person who is, oh, excellent. I see someone else has started recording. Great. So I will stop my recording in the background. But as I was saying, if you, when you're not presenting, just please be sure that your microphone is muted and your camera is off. Those buttons are up in the upper right-hand corner, and the share your screen button for our presenters is also up there as well. It is right next to the leave button, so be careful where you're clicking. But otherwise, that should be good. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone. My name is Susan. Susan Vandergriff. I am the Scholarly Communications Librarian over at UCCS. I am so excited to be here chairing your session, and I'm thrilled to be introducing our first presenter, and it's Jackson Ayers. So Jackson, if you want to take it away.
Thank you, Susan. I'll go ahead and share my screen. How's that coming through? Just fine?
Yep, it looks great.
Fantastic. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jackson Ayers, and I would say thank you for attending, but thank you for presenting along with me in the room today. I'll be talking about the ethnic minority question in China during the first decade of the People's Republic, that is 1949 to 1959. I'd like to start by directing everyone's attention to the quote at the top of this propaganda poster. If you can read Chinese, you can follow along. If not, this phrase means, "Long live the great unity of all of the peoples of the entire nation." It doesn't translate as cleanly as this simple phrase does on the poster, but it's indicative of ethnicity and ethnicity's place within Chinese nationalism. And why is this so important? And why do so many propaganda posters from this period show ethnic unity? Various people of different groups dancing hand in hand, arm in arm under the banner of the Communist Party. It begins first in the Qing dynasty. That is the final dynasty before the cycle ended in 1911. Most of China and most of central China is of the Han ethnic group. Today, the population is 95% Han, kind of different from the United States, where our ethnic makeup is much more diverse and balanced in different percentages. The Qing dynasty, however, was ruled by the Manchus from the north. And common sort of Manchu indicator was a queue, or the long braid you may recognize from kung fu movies. As the Qing dynasty declined in power, Han chauvinism, Han nationalism, that is a identity based on ethnicity itself, started to grow. Han men would cut their queues to indicate that they no longer identified with the Manchu control that they'd been under for centuries. Eventually, this Han chauvinism grew, exploded beyond the bounds of the Qing dynasty, and it collapsed in 1911. In the Republican period, Sun Yat-sen, China's ideological founder, both of the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party, interestingly enough, established a five peoples model for ethnic nationalism. Those five peoples being the Han, as we already talked about, Tibetans, Mongolians, Manchus, and Hui. The Hui ethnic minority within China is really unique because they are Muslim. In fact, little interesting linguistic anecdote here, the traditional Chinese word for Islam is Huijiao, meaning the religion of the Hui people. But over time, as they recognized new groups and new ethnicities that practiced Islam, they changed and developed a new word for the religion itself. As Mao Zedong rose to power within the Communist Party, he wrote a work entitled On New Democracy. This laid the foundation for the entire party and their proletarian revolution within China. He used a very unique four-character phrase in this book, Zhonghua Mingzu, which means something between American national identity and ethnic relations. It was actually a loan word from Japan in the 19th century. And he grabbed onto this four-character phrase to describe the future of China's national identity, inherently tied to ethnicity. This map is incredibly important to the analysis that I'll walk you all through today because it demonstrates not only the fractured state of China and China's borders during the 1940s, but it also demonstrates some of the major powers that will come into play throughout the 50s. So this fractured border regions, they included Manchukuo, where the Manchus came from during the Qing dynasty. That was a tributary state under Japanese imperial expansion. And then to the west, Xinjiang and Tibet, both of those are pretty big in the news right now. But as of 1940 in this map, it was not internationally recognized as a part of China. The green region in the center is where ethnically China is predominantly Han. This map demonstrates the key question and the key answer to some of the ethnic policies and domestic ethnic policies that China implemented during the 1950s. That is that they fell along the border between China and its allies or enemies to the north, west, and to the south. Those allies being India and the Soviet Union, and those enemies being imperialist Western forces in French Indochina and soon to be Vietnam. Now, to start breaking down some of these regions, I'll be covering Inner Mongolia to the north, Xinjiang to the west, Tibet to the southwest, and then Guangxi province is surrounded by Yunnan, Guangdong, Hunan, Guizhou, and is another significant autonomous region during this period. Inner Mongolia, for a little background, had extensive political and ethnic history with Han dynasties and Han governments. They were a part of the Republican government after the Qing dynasty fell. And as I listed before, Mongolians were considered a part of China's five peoples model developed by Sun Yat-sen. When Mao Zedong and Soviet leadership met to discuss the fate of Mongolia and Inner Mongolia, the Soviet Union was very quick to give complete control to China over Inner Mongolia and allow them to implement whatever policies they deemed necessary to execute their full communist revolution. When that occurred within Inner Mongolia, the Chinese government quickly implemented standard collectivization and Marxist-Leninist reform, but interestingly, they maintained Mongolian governmental structures. Politically, Inner Mongolia kept its traditional roots and how its people governed itself, and it gained the title of Special Autonomous Region. The remaining three provinces that I'll discuss today also became special autonomous regions over time. Now, the key takeaways from this and the key reasons to understand Inner Mongolia's collectivization and Marxist-Leninist reform, but political autonomy, are twofold. The first being cooperation between the Soviet Union and China. The second being this ethnic and political history, a long-standing tie between Han and the people of the Han Communist government and those of Mongolia. Cooperation between these governments created unique stability in which the Communist Party could allow some semblance, and it's debatable how real this was, but some semblance of autonomy within the region. And to the west, Xinjiang, this is a very important distinction to make. Uyghurs in Xinjiang are not, or they don't appear ethnically Chinese. They are ethnically Turkic. Their practices and traditions are very different from those of the Han people to the east. In history, Xinjiang was a separate state which had close ties to dynasties and engaged in a lot of Silk Road trade, but was never, like the Mongolians or the Manchus, was never recognized by the Republican government as a part of the Five Peoples model. Uyghurs, in fact, towards the end of the Chinese Civil War leading up to 1949, they were seen as allies of the nationalist government, the KMT or the GMD, and were repressed pretty heavily up until 1949. As soon as the PRC took power, they implemented immense autonomy throughout the state, and that is of a political nature, just like in Inner Mongolia. Now, what makes Xinjiang unique, as I noted earlier with Mongolia, there was stability with the Soviet Union. In later decades, as the Sino-Soviet relationship fell apart, they started to jockey for control along that western border. But at this point in history, there was no disagreement over either border definition or control within the region. Unlike Mongolia, however, Xinjiang was ethnically unique. It was new from a geopolitical standpoint. It had not been incorporated into Chinese governance up until that point. So the response was a little bit different. They created the same sort of political autonomy, but if anything, the autonomy within the region extended even into education and to small cultural things such as the practice of Islam and day-to-day lifestyles. They were not incorporated into the same communist reform like Inner Mongolia was, most likely because they were ethnically unique. To the southwest, Tibet had a pretty long-standing and sometimes tumultuous relationship with Chinese dynasties or even the Republican government. Tibetans were included in Sun Yat-sen's Five Peoples model. But in 1950, when PLA troops were moving through southern China and forcing out nationalists, when General Zhang, the leader of those PLA forces, got to Tibet, he stopped his officers and told them, do not do anything to disrupt the Tibetan aristocracy, which blew my mind when I read that. Unlike any other communist revolution in history, they wanted to preserve the governmental structure native to Tibet. At this point in time, India and China had grown as partners in the non-aligned movement. They recognized each other as victims of imperialism, Western imperialism. And so that stability, much like the stability with the Soviet Union, allowed for immense and almost non-Marxist-Leninist autonomy within Tibet. They were at a fundamentally different point in Stalin's economic developmental model, and so they received a lot of consolations in that direction. Tibet also benefited from their ethnic history with the dynastic system and the Republican government, allowing incredible freedom, which obviously is not seen today. It's changed significantly since that first decade of the party. Now, I think I've said the word enough for these three provinces, but the key is stability. There was stability externally between China and the Soviet Union and China and India. Their foreign policy relations created the environment in which they allowed economic, political, cultural, and ethnic freedom to the people at their border. Now to move to Guangxi province, and this is where the story gets really interesting because it lacked the same stability that any of these border regions had. At this point in time, the French involvement in Indochina is coming to a close. As soon as the party was established in 1949, the PRC started to send money and send support and military advisory groups to the DRV. In fact, Zhou Enlai seeking potentially some of the stability that they had in India and the Soviet Union, advised Ho Chi Minh to slow down and at the Geneva Conference of 1954 seek some sort of compromise. Compromise would mean a buffer state, and compromise would mean stability. That, however, did not happen. And so the Chinese government launched the Ethnic Classification Project, a entirely unique, as far as I can tell, endeavor to go out into the field and define the ethnicities of southern China. When they got there, they employed a combination of a British linguistic approach and a Stalinist economic approach to define what exactly an ethnicity is. When they went out and asked people what ethnicity they identified with, along with some other census type numbers, they got hundreds of various responses. Sometimes one word meant multiple ethnicities, or multiple ethnicities and multiple words meant one group. It was incredibly complicated. And it demonstrated the very, very complex nature of the region, kind of geographically and topographically, which caused fractured groups to interact on their own and develop their own cultural practices. In response, the ethnic classification team developed 55 ethnic minorities, and the 55 encompassed all of China. And in this process, they took the diversity of southern China and condensed them, broke them apart along linguistic, geographic, economic lines, and they forced people to identify in entirely new ethnicities which they had never identified with before. This cultural re-education fundamentally changed the shape of China's ethnic project and ethnic classification. The key points here: there was no stability and there was no ethnic history of a positive relationship. If anything, there was a long-standing history of clash between Cantonese cultures and Mandarin cultures to the north. So as a result, the party implemented incredibly strict controls. At the end of the day, this is so important because it demonstrates that foreign policies and internal ethnic history can have an immense impact on China's relationship to its own people. And it also demonstrates the primacy of ethnicity within China's own sense of nationalism. In fact, they aren't distinguishable in any way. Ethnicity is fundamentally tied to the nationalism project within the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackson. Yes, yeah, applause emojis. So does anyone have any questions for Jackson? And you can go ahead and put those in the chat if you do have any. So we've got somebody typing here. Oh, we've got a couple of people typing. Excellent. Well, I guess while we wait, I did say this earlier to you as we were kind of waiting to get started. This has a lot of kind of current relevance just because of what's going on with the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs in the Xinjiang region, right?
Yep.
And so what has changed now to kind of destabilize that to an extent where those ethnic minorities are being targeted?
So I would love to have done this research across the breadth of the PRC's history, but that could be probably a multi-volume sort of question to address. But I think a big thing was the end of the Sino-Soviet stability. 1959, it started to get shaky. Things fell apart. And then there was posturing about communist power, and like Maoism became a distinct ideology separate from any sort of Marxist-Leninist concept. And then the Cultural Revolution started a decade after that. And that really broke down a lot of what Mao had been doing in the beginning of the PRC's term, really changed the nature of the internal dynamics of the country. So a lot fractured in that 10-year period. And then as soon as a new leader came in, when Deng Xiaoping came in, things opened up once again. So really crazy cyclical and dynamic history. And I decided to look at that one window of stability that's open to us.
Nice, thank you. All right, so we've got some other questions here. So Jackson, if you could describe the ethnic makeup of China's main governmental party, how would you describe it? And do you think that relates to your project?
So there's actually a really interesting governmental body. So it's a weird structure distinct from our three-part system in the United States, but they do have a National People's Congress, which is marginally attached to the government and is responsible for legislative tasks that the Communist Party system may not handle or address. And in the National People's Congress, they give a seat, and it's very much a token seat, but they give one to each of the ethnic minorities. And it's always a big show. There's a procession when the People's Congresses begin, and they lead the ethnic minorities in, dressed traditionally. The interesting thing there is that these ethnic minorities that are represented were placed upon them in the 50s by this classification project. So it was very prescriptive, and they're now pretty much they're benefiting from that fact by giving token representation to the government and to that National People's Congress. Did that answer your question, Audrey? Thanks.
Excellent. And we've got one more question for you. What do you believe is Xi Jinping's strategy for dealing with minorities for China's future, given the current PRC's hostile stance to social issues?
I think it's hard to apply my analytical framework and this idea of domestic versus foreign policy into what's going on with Xi Jinping now. The geopolitical context is very different. If we think of China on a scale from 1949 to their century-long goal of 2049, we're in a very different position there as well. I think it is hard to say, but I do think stability and security of the border and security of that fundamental Chinese national identity is important. I don't think that concept is going to go away. And depending on the time period, it manifests itself differently. We're seeing a lot of really worrying things in Xinjiang now, but it is still about stability or security. Oh, ma'am, I think you're muted.
Sorry, thank you. Yes, so I was just going to say we are at time, but thank you so much, Jackson, for your great presentation and for these great answers that you've been giving us here. If you have more questions for Jackson, I would encourage you to put them in the chat and he can address them there. So yeah, thank you again.
Thank you.
All right, and I'll introduce our next speaker, who is Audrey Phillips.
Yes, hi, let me get my slides pulled up real quick.
Absolutely.
Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Cadet Second Class Audrey Phillips, and today I will be talking about the roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So let me just preface and say, this is kind of still a hot topic in today's world, and I'm by no means taking a stance on the moral or ethic righteousness of either side, but this is just kind of me going back in time and seeing, okay, where did this problem really start? So, my overall thesis is that the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict has its roots in the failure of British decision-making, the insensitivity of the United Nations concerning a nation of different people and ethnicities, and Britain's failure to assist in the partitioning process. So I kind of started looking into this topic because I really wanted to know, I was like, okay, how, because the Middle East today has its roots in World War I and everything that happened with the big powerful nations in Europe coming in and partitioning. And my research kind of led me to discover that a lot of it has to do with Britain and the imperial role that they played over in the Middle East. So in order to have a good understanding of this situation, we really need to look at Zionism and the Balfour Declaration. So Zionism was a late 19th century movement, and it's the idea that the Jewish people need their own homeland. So Israel made the most sense as a homeland because of its connections with ancient Judaism and the 12 tribes of Israel and the kingdom of Israel. So this idea wasn't like initially, the idea wasn't like, okay, let's go back to Israel. It was more like Jewish people in Europe were facing prosecution since the 1800s and since before that. I mean, we can look all the way back to the Black Plague and see how they suffered from that because they were discriminated against because their communities were healthier. And so they kind of avoided the Black Plague, and like they have faced so much violence across centuries. And so this was kind of a long time coming. But the Balfour Declaration, the important thing we need to look at is that middle paragraph, which says that His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So right from the start, Britain is trying to be incredibly diplomatic about this situation, by clearly stating that the Palestinians will not be denied any rights or liberties. But at the same time, Britain is like claiming responsibility for both of these groups, the Jews and the Palestinians, which leads me to my next point, which is the Sykes-Picot and the Mandate of Palestine, Sykes-Picot Conference and the Mandate of Palestine. So this was the conference that granted Britain the Palestinian Mandate. As you can see, the European powers divided up the Ottoman Empire after World War I. It was a huge power grab. It was a massive extension of imperialism. This conference is what led to the mandate system of the 20th century. So all of these countries were like quote unquote adopted by like the greater European powers with like the understanding that these countries could not govern themselves and that they needed guidance. And obviously that's, reaching a little bit and kind of brushes into that whole Orientalism look where, okay, well, we are superior to all of these people and all of these countries, right? But this is how Britain gained complete control over Palestine. So on my slides, it says Britain and Russia supported the Zionist movement, and they did. Part of that goes back to what I was saying about like violence across Europe towards Jews, like not just in Germany, even though all of that was happening, which led up to the Holocaust and whatnot. But in Russia, like Jewish people were facing pogroms, which were just raids. Like Russian people would go into Jewish communities, raid, rape, pillage, whatever, and then leave. And so like going back to that idea of Zionism kind of being like a long time in coming, Britain and Russia both supported the Zionist movement because Russia kind of wanted the Jews out of their country. And Britain knew that if they could get Jewish support within the country, they would have a lot more support in the Labour Party on the domestic side. So this leads us to the next main point of my argument, which is understanding Britain's role in the Middle East. So essentially, Britain started out with an endorsement for both the Palestinians and the Jews. Like we talked about that in the Balfour Declaration, right? They said, we will not deny the Palestinians any of their rights, or, we could try to keep this as equal as possible, but we still want a home for the Jewish people in Israel. So the goal was to create this homeland without disrupting or denying the Palestinians. In the White Papers of 1922, however, Winston Churchill declared that the Jewish homeland would be in Israel, which rests upon historical connection. That is like the birthright of the Kingdom of Israel. So now we're kind of stretching a little bit more. Now it's become, oh, well, we have the natural claim on ownership, right? Like this is our land, even though it was, hundreds of thousands of years ago, it's still our land. So instead, after the White Papers were issued, though, Britain didn't act in the region for almost 30 years. So immigration was allowed for Jewish people from Britain and from other countries into Palestine, but Britain wasn't really doing anything once they got there. They were kind of just letting them loose, letting them live there. And I think that's a very kind of naive way of doing things, especially when you have control over an entire country, for Britain to kind of just go hands off and say, oh, they'll figure it out, right? Like it seems very counterintuitive. So in 1947, though, in response to region-wide tensions, because there was a lot of headbutting between the Palestinians and the Jews, naturally, makes sense, Britain halted all Jewish immigration to the region. So this is another example of how Britain was kind of just wavering in their decision-making. It seems like they were going back and forth, like trying to please big groups of people. And we also have the specter of World War II, right? Like it's happening, the Holocaust is going on, which is gonna increase immigration to Palestine like tenfold. Like suddenly it's not just Jews in Europe. All of a sudden it's like Jews in America are like, let's get out of here. Like we don't know if that's ever going to happen to us, right? So this is definitely like that failure to kind of make a decision and to commit to something that's definitely on Britain, and it was a huge part of the roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So this actually leads me to my next point, which is how the United Nations comes into this whole situation. Because Britain basically used the United Nations as a place to dump Palestine when they couldn't support it. Because like I said, we got World War II going on. I mean, the economy's in shambles, half the men are dead, right? They have barely just recovered from World War I. Like, so yeah, it does make sense. Like, if, Britain couldn't take care of the mandate, then they need to move on. Like, it's not our problem anymore. But like, the issue that I found in my research was that Britain could have had such a bigger role in even the partitioning of the Middle East, and they didn't. So that leads me to my next slide, which is the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. So initially, in the White Papers of 1922, Churchill declared that Palestine would not be taken over by the Jews, but rather Palestine would be heavily populated by Jewish settlements. So that kind of begs the question, like, what does that mean? Like, what does that look like? And how can a government strictly control settlements in a country that wasn't really theirs to begin with, right? They have this partition, they have this mandate, but what does that mean? That's kind of like a much bigger question having to do with imperialism, but we see these European countries come in and try and take over, and it's like you can't put different cultures into the same box that your culture is, right? It's not going to work. So from the start, you can maybe say this was kind of a doomed project. Anyways, in 1947, due mostly to the economic hardships that Britain was undergoing after World War II, Britain turned the mandate over to the United Nations and did so, quote unquote, without recommendation. So basically, they washed their hands of it. They said, we're not even going to say what we think you should do. We are just going to be done with it. Not our problem anymore. United Nations, this is all you. So Britain no longer wanted this country or any of its issues. This was honestly a pretty big moment of irresponsibility. Like, the country that had received the mandate, which was Britain, had made all of these grandeur promises to both the Jews and the Palestinians, but was now willing to make this just not their issue anymore, right? And even from like a completely historical perspective, it's like that probably wasn't a very good idea, because now the one group that maybe had a closer specialization or understanding of Palestine and Israel and how those two groups were going to interact is just completely done with it. We're not going to provide any advice. But going back a couple years into 1937, before Britain handed over the mandate to the United Nations, Britain instituted what was called the Peel Commission. So essentially, this commission tried to understand the source of conflict between the Jews and the Palestinians. Instead, the commission came back and said that there was no solution, the two people could never live harmoniously, and that the best solution to this problem would be to create three separate states: an Arab state, a Jewish state, and a neutral state. So the neutral state would comprise all the holy monuments to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, because as we all know, Israel is a huge hotspot for some of the biggest religions in the world. So after this commission, Britain basically said, like, this is too hard, not our problem anymore. And like I said, what with World War II going on, they could not afford the kind of policing or peacekeeping effort that would be required to make three separate nation states. They were like, we can't do this. This is honestly out of our hands. So that was why they decided that the United Nations should take it over instead. So that leads me to my next point, like, how did the UN decide to partition Palestine? And like, this slide is titled the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, but I'll actually get into it a little bit more in my next point, which is like the issue of Jewish identity. So essentially, this slide focuses on how the partitioning process did not take into account Jewish and Palestinian identities. Instead, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, it was comprised of 11 countries, none of which really had a ton of relation to the situation. So those countries were Australia, Canada, Czechoslovakia, Guatemala, India, Iran, the Netherlands, Peru, Sweden, Uruguay, and Yugoslavia. I'm sure just from listing those alone, you can kind of see why I was like, why are these countries the ones that the United Nations chose to make this huge decision? Well, the idea was that these countries would be nonpartisan, non-biased, but then you lose, like I was saying earlier, you lose that little bit of expertise edge, right? Like, Britain could have stepped in and said, hey, this is my recommendation for what we do as the resident expert, quote unquote, in the last 40 years in this region. Like, here's what I think that maybe we should do. So aside from Iran, none of these countries really had any real claim or relation to the conflict at hand. This conglomerate of countries made the partitioning incredibly poor, and the UNSCOP viewed all the immigrant Jews as one identity. So this created a lot of problems concerning Jewish identity. So essentially, there were two main types of Jews immigrating into Palestine. There were the Ashkenazi and the Mizrahi. So the Ashkenazi were the European Jews, and the Mizrahi were Jews coming from North Africa and the Levant. Naturally, these two groups don't have a ton in common aside from a shared religion, and even then there are so many variations of that religion dictated by geography and language barriers. And like, I mean, you can see the Hasidic Jews and you can see like the people who are non-Hasidic Jews, and it's two very different types, right? There's kind of a spectrum of Judaism, like most religions. These Jews definitely coming in felt the pressure to be one united front, so they started calling themselves the Yishuv instead. So this slow process of Jewish unification only muddled the situation even more, and perhaps a lot of this could have been remedied if there was any type of control or census or anything concerning immigration into the country. Like that was all Britain's responsibility, and they could have stepped up, and they didn't. So additionally, the Palestinians saw the Jewish migration or immigration as an influx of land thieves. So Palestinians who lived out in the country and were tenant farmers were losing their land because the landlords which lived in the city, they were selling their property to the Jews without telling them. So naturally, this situation had a lot of pitfalls, and it required a great deal of understanding between both the groups, and that is where that policing definitely could have come in and made a big difference, like that peacekeeping effort. But instead, like Israelis and Palestinians were just constantly at odds. So in conclusion, out of all the European countries, Britain specifically is responsible for the root causes of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, and then just to kind of bring it into a modern context, like this issue can be traced to conflict in the modern world. Like, for example, the War of 1948. Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Transjordan, all of those countries declared war on Israel because they saw the partition as a theft of Arab land and an invasion. I mean, it would be ambitious to say that the roots of this conflict could be traced back to Britain alone. Like, I'm in no way saying that. But there are a lot of other moving parts, especially with the powerful five in Europe. But for the sake of this presentation, I pared it down to focus on Britain's responsibility in the region. The bottom line is that this issue took a back burner after World War I. When World War II kicked off, it was even less of a problem. And yet, here we are, almost over 100 years after the Mandate of Palestine was given to Britain, and we are still feeling the effects and the tensions of Britain's role in the Middle East. So thank you all for your time. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. I am so excited to hear your questions.
Thank you, Audrey. So yes, if you have any questions for Audrey, please go ahead and put those in the chat. And yes, please clap hands emojis for Audrey as well. So it looks like we have some questions coming in. So I guess as we wait, I will start with one of mine. So you tied this move to Zionism in Britain and to kind of the segregationist idea in Russia, but it seems to me like the timeline, it also would have aligned with a lot of the anti-Semitism that would have been, well, I mean, it's always been pervasive in Britain, but I mean, like, you know, the black shirt anti-Semitism that would have been on the rise kind of up to the start of World War II. Do you see Britain also as attempting to do kind of a segregationist thing where they're just looking to move Jews out of their country?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like I mentioned with like the Russian pogroms, like this discrimination was going on across the entire region, across all of Europe, right? And like Zionism, like I said, it got started way back in the 1800s, and it was like this push for a home, like some place where we can just be ourselves and not be governed and discriminated against by these massive European nations, right? So I think so, absolutely. In Britain specifically, like there was still that push for like, you know, maybe we're not being persecuted like we are in Russia, but we're still not exactly welcome. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And it looks like we've got some others coming in the chat. So Audrey, I'm curious about how your research has reflected the larger imperial rivalry in the Middle East, particularly between France and Britain on the subject of Syria and the wider Levant post-World War II. How much did that rivalry, coincident with the withdrawal from India, impact British decisions?
That's a good question. That tackles a lot of different topics. Well, looking back at the Ottoman Empire as a whole, right, because the reason that Britain even got the Palestinian mandate was because all these powers got together and said, hey, we're going to break up the Ottoman Empire after World War I. Before that, though, Britain really wanted the Ottoman Empire to stay together because they wanted that easy trade route to India. So when Britain started pulling out of India, all of a sudden it was like, okay, well, why are we still invested in the Ottoman Empire. Like let's take the piece that we want and get out of here. I'm not super familiar with French and Britain relations, but I think that like the whole withdrawing from India, I think that was a lot of that was kind of just a precursor to Britain eventually withdrawing from the Middle East as a whole. I hope that answers your question, Dr. Leonard.
All right, and we've got another question for you. What role did the media, the news, have in these debates/decisions outside of Jewish or Palestinian control?
That's a super good question. I can tell you what it looked like in America, and I can tell you what it looked like in Europe. So, and this was, I touched on this in the paper that this research is based off of, talking more about like the powerful five, like what it looked like in Europe when all of this was happening. So there was a lot of sympathy for the Jews in Europe after World War II, especially. It was like, okay, like, when Britain sacrificed that mandate and said, hey, we don't want it anymore, it was like a big thing in the United Nations because like, okay, let's do this. Let's make a homeland for the Jews. And that sentiment was reflected in America too. But then there was also that kind of that backlash of like, okay, but whose land are we taking right now? Like I touched on it in my slides too with the Palestinians. Like there were already people living in that land. So then that is where this like conflict today kind of comes from too, is like, okay, who is right? Whose does this land actually belong to? Because like the Jews have this historical tie back to the kingdom of Israel, but the Palestinians have been living there for the last 100 or so years, right? So I think that there was, most of it was a lot of positive Jewish sentiment, like yes, let's make these people a country. But on the other side, there was kind of that argument that was surfacing was like, okay, but what about everyone else that already lives there?
Thank you. Do we have any other questions for Audrey? We've got time for maybe one or two more. All right. Well, thank you so much, Audrey, for that great presentation and those wonderful answers. And we'll go ahead and bring up our next speaker, Robert Kirsten.
Hello, thank you.
Yeah, very welcome.
All right. Is that viewable for everyone in the call?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. So, my name is RJ Kirsten. I am a cadet at the United States Air Force Academy, and my major is behavioral science. I just wanted to start by thanking all of the CSURF staff and everyone that made this event possible today. A big shout out to Colonel Harrington, who's in the English department, who helped me and encouraged me to present today. So as I said, just to get the introduction out of the way, I am RJ Kirsten, and I'm a sophomore. So I didn't really think that this book, Waiting for the Barbarians by J.M. Coetzee, would really have that much of an impact on my own view of the world until I started really getting into the book and going through it. And today, basically what I'm going to talk about is how that impact happened for me, and how, kind of what that timeline was for me, and how I think that it impacts everyone that's in this call. Excuse me, I practice on Zoom, so my technology skills are a little bit rusty. But so what I think is so important about this book specifically is J.M. Coetzee's description of power and how he chooses to show that. And I'm really excited with the two presentations that went before me, because I think you're going to be able to draw a lot of parallels as you kind of look at each of these presentations in correlation with mine. So just to start out, a short summary. J.M. Coetzee, the author, was born in South Africa, and he was a staunch opposition to the apartheid movement. And throughout this presentation, you're going to see how that greatly affected what he perceived as the negative effects of power, if you're familiar with the apartheid movement in South Africa at all. He's published many novels about the negative effects of colonization, and this one is no different. So, as I said, the big idea is power, and I just wanted to start off with this quote by Abraham Lincoln, because I think it's very telling, especially for people that are, very impressionable in their educational careers. So, you know, we all are told that adversity builds character and that we should embrace adversity throughout, but it's not really about that when you get into the larger scale of how your actions affect others. And once somebody has power and they have that ability to wield such power, it really changes that person, sometimes for the worse. And actually, honestly, from my research, separate from this project in power, it often changes people for the worse. So, excuse me. Before we get on to that, I just want to do a little short summary about the book itself for those of you that haven't read it. The main character is the magistrate, and the magistrate is kind of sheriff, if you're unfamiliar with that as well. And we're going to follow the magistrate through his life and his trials and tribulations. He lives in a village that is quite literally on the fence between the Empire and these nomadic barbarians. And the Empire, unlimited resources, very developed, technologically advanced, has a very strict organizational structure. Some of you might be starting to see some connections to some organizations that you know, but also on the other side of that fence is these nomadic barbarians, and they have nothing. They're starving. They're searching for food, doing everything they can to really survive. So Kotse represents this empire and gives the empire a voice by employing somebody called Colonel Joel. Now, Colonel Joel is a very well-dressed man, very power imposing, uses his power and wields it and walks with a sense of entitlement almost, right? So he comes to the village and starts directing the magistrate and worrying the magistrate that there is an attack imminent from these barbarian forces. The same ones that are starving with no weapons or anything like that, but they're mounting some sort of attack on the empire, and it is the magistrate's job to find information about said attack. So this leads the magistrate to start employing some torture characteristics and some very, very poor practices when it comes to humanitarian efforts with these barbarians, and leaving some of them with horrible injuries like becoming blind or losing limbs or things like that. So the magistrate eventually, at some point in the novel, takes in a barbarian beggar who's been on the street in his village. And Kotse, I think, includes this to kind of offer some perspective on where our sources of sympathy are, so that we don't necessarily have to resort to empathy. Because as you'll see as this presentation progresses, there's kind of a forced empathy that's put on the magistrate that he will realize later. But the magistrate takes in this girl, and he has sort of a growing experience with her. It starts out very poorly, though. He treats her almost as a pet, as far as making jokes about how the other people in the town are saying that he's keeping a fox in his room or something like that. But he starts to grow and starts to humanize the barbarian woman a little bit, and then that eventually turns into a struggle with his own sexuality, which I'll touch on a little bit later, but is very interesting. That kind of his epiphany moment is him thinking, okay, I have to get this girl back to her family, and he takes her to the barbarian village in which she is originally from. Once he returns, though, he finds that his seat as the magistrate has been taken and by one of his soldiers while he was gone, and they're imposing their own power upon the city. And in fact, they imprison the magistrate for abandoning his post to return this barbarian girl. So now we have this big change in the story where the magistrate is now the prisoner. He's being tortured. He keeps requesting a fair trial, which is ironic because he never gave a fair trial to any of his prisoners when he was in power. So kind of putting him right in the situation to show him what he was doing. And then eventually the colony kind of starts to break down. Once the magistrate is released from prison, he's released with no possessions. He turns into a beggar, like the girl that he kind of developed his empathy for the barbarians with. And the colony starts to break down. Soldiers are dying on their escapades with preventative strikes and preventative war and things like that. And it's really, really just starting to tear apart society towards the end of the novel. Why this is important, right, is that power aspect that you could see come up a lot in the quick summary that I gave you. Now, I drew this into 3 separate types of power: colonial power, individual power, and then something that I'm calling identity power, but really that's a portion of individual power, but I think it's evident and important enough to identify on its own. So power, and one of the symptoms of it is the endless pursuit of more power. There is no point where you have enough power to feel like you're established enough and you'll stop chasing that power. Now, this is especially evident with the empire and the individual power because that power is specifically relative, right? There's always something you're comparing yourself to in order to feel that power. So when we look at the empire, we have a nameless empire that is immense in resources, strength, and numbers, and it is only rivaled by these nomadic barbarians, right? So the power imbalance there is incredible, right? It's almost insurmountable in some ways, and there's really no advantages that the barbarians have over the empire, which leaves it immensely powerful. But we see throughout the novel the attack on these barbarians as that pursuit of higher power, right? There is no cap for this empire, and we never get introduced to any other empires. But say there was another empire that was of equal resources and land, and now that empire is effectively powerless because it has no comparative advantages, right? The second kind of power I want to touch on is individual power. And individual power relies also on relational power, but Coetzee does a really good job of explaining individual power through profession, sexual encounters, and self-worth. So we see the profession as demonstrated by the magistrate specifically, as he goes through his daily job when he is the magistrate. You can tell he's kind of got some reservations about a couple of the things he's doing, but the power of his position allows him and affords him the right to do whatever he wants. We also see this when he comes back and he does not have that position. He is effectively powerless, having to regain the trust of the people, regain the village's, just to be a person and a person operating within the village and not just some beggar on the street. He has to regain all of that because he lost his position. It's no fault of the magistrate on his own. It's none of his actions. It's simply the process of him losing his job that renders him powerless within his society. Also, I think Coetzee does a fantastic job of including some sexual encounters that I think are often overlooked when we talk about individual power, especially in this kind of sense. People use sex as a means to exert power over somebody else, and the magistrate is no different. He has multiple sexual partners throughout the book that are increasingly less powerful in relation to himself. We talk about the barbarian girl who is obviously effectively powerless. She has no name, she has no identity, she has no belongings. She is basically at the mercy of the magistrate. But he also talks about how this progression of himself works, and he mentions this specifically in the novel about how his taste in sexual partners effectively grows less and less powerful. So he wants the less and less powerfuls. Eventually, he says that he'll have so little desire for anyone with any power that he may start having a lust for children at some point, which is obviously disgusting and gross, but it's very telling about how the progression of the man as he weakens in his old age is seeking even less powerful partners. So I want to talk about a little bit about identity with some of the time that I have left. And I think that identity power is something that's very, very prevalent in today's arena, especially with all the discussions around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all of the parts that go along with that, right? So Coetzee, now fittingly, J.M. Coetzee, who doesn't even want to identify himself by his name, doesn't have a lot of names within his novel. He takes very, very careful precautions and a very exclusive route when naming his characters. In fact, you never know the name of the main character or the empire or any of the barbarians. They are all nameless, and that is to resolve them of any identity. Now, when you first start getting into the novel and you're reading through this, you kind of base your assumptions off of, okay, well, there's nothing really to go off of, so I can't really stereotype this person. But then as you go through the novel, your brain wants to develop some sort of backstory for these individuals, right? So as you're reading about these people, you go from kind of this like, well, I don't have any stereotypes to enforce, to I am only judging this person by stereotypes from that I have seen in my life. And that is also a form of power, because these individuals have some divining characteristic that you have deemed to be in some relation to you. And that is a fantastic subtle note that J.M. Coetzee decides to include within this. Now, I'm going to jump back to this slide, and if you'll see here, the magistrate is in the middle of this PowerPoint intentionally, because all of these outside factors are influencing the magistrate and his development throughout the novel, right? So at the beginning, we have Colonel Joel, who's enforcing his will and the will of the empire into the magistrate for him to comply, to comply, to comply. And the magistrate does it with little to no question, because Colonel Joel has so much power relational to the magistrate. Now, the barbarian girl comes in on the other side and starts influencing him in the opposite direction. Now, this is a more intimate relationship, so it has a different effect on his processes, and he ends up relying on different parts of his life to, satisfy the barbarian girl's inquiries and questions and things like that. The girl at the inn is another step in the power progression for our magistrate, as she is basically somebody that he goes and gets a lot of things off his chest to, and also has sexual encounters with, but also influences the magistrate with some small talk and some conversations where the magistrate can really lay out what he's thinking. The barbarians are also applying pressure on the magistrate as a sort of looming threat that is always there. And as you come to find out at the end of the novel, some spoiler alerts coming, but as you come to find out at the end of the novel, the barbarians are not a threat at all. They never mount an attack. They never have any organized progression. It's merely a group of people that are too desperate to sit in place. And then finally, you have the Empire, which is kind of the security net of the magistrate. And when he has his job, right? So he has to comply, or else he loses all that he knows. So this concludes the presentation part of my presentation. If we have any questions, I would love to take them at this time. I believe you're muted, Matt.
Thank you. The perils of this online world. Yes. Thank you, RJ. And yeah, if we have any questions about this presentation, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and I will share them out. As we're waiting, I guess I can start us with one. So RJ, it struck me, especially as you said, there's a lot of connections between this and the presentations we've already seen, and it seems like there's just some identity, some power that's granted in just the ability to be an individual, right? That there seems to be, especially in the kind of collectivist treatment of both the ethnic minorities in China that we heard about from Jackson, as well as the compression of all of those Jewish identities that we heard about from Audrey, the sense that it's almost, when there's someone who's in power, there isn't this chance given to individualize that, but that there is really just more of they're not us, and that's the only identity they're given. So is there just power in being allowed to be an individual at all?
Yeah, so that's really interesting, and something I noticed in my reading and while I was listening to the other presentations is that dynamic, that there is this colonial power that is ever looming over all of the individuals within some sort of organization or country, if you will, and then within that country or organization, there are individuals who also have relational power to each other. But like you said, the colony has the ability to strip away that power at any time. We look at that with the redistribution of land in Israel, and these not recognizing ethnic minorities in China, right? So there's always this sort of, I need to have more power relational to my neighbor, but all that can be taken away or upset by a colonial power above that.
I mean, absolutely. If the magistrate's not the magistrate, who is he within the story?
Right, exactly.
All right, so we do have some questions here. We've got very nice work. I'm curious about the links you find between the plot / the narrative and his larger critique of apartheid.
So, really, what I got out of his critique of the apartheid is his long-standing disagreement and battle against colonialist movements in history, right? So, he actually left South Africa and went to the States. He went to the University of Texas to get his education here, and then while the apartheid was going on, he returned and was an advocate against it. But as far as the plot specifically, it really is this kind of you go on this mission to return the barbarian girl to her village. It's your higher calling. Maybe him going to the University of Texas and then seeing, okay, maybe I can't survive out here on my own, and I need to go back to that original source of power where he got his his start, and then going back to South Africa to fight the apartheid from the inside out rather than trying to band with the barbarians. And I think there is a lot of himself in the magistrate, and I think that's a very good question, very observant too. Thank you.
All right, and we've got one more. So you've talked about apartheid in South Africa, but do you believe the author may have been referring to any other particular countries or societies?
Right. So I can't say for sure. I'm not I'm not Mr. Coetzee, but I definitely can draw some parallels from the reading that I did and the close reading I did, and really the ambiguity and the ambiguous nature of the way in which he describes the empire and the handlings of the empire. There's no clear form of government. You just know that there's some hierarchical structure. There is no names or any sentiment of a religion or anything of that such either. So I think he is trying to take aim at all countries that are colonialist in nature in a way that allows the reader to kind of build that in their own head, right? So, as an American citizen, of course, I relate a lot of the ideas that he talks about to the American history because it's part of my education, right? So, whereas I think somebody who grew up in another country that had some sort of colonialist period, or more importantly, was colonized at some point, is going to view the reading and build an empire differently in their head than say I do, if that answers your question.
All right, we got some applause there, so I think so. Any other questions for RJ? All right, well, if not, thank you so much for your presentation. That was wonderful, and thank you for your great answers. And we'll go ahead and get on to our last presenter for today, Abigail Apsland. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Asplin, ma'am, but close.
All right.
Okay. I just need to pull it up here. Can you guys see it?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. All right, so hi everyone, my name is Abigail Asplund. I am a sophomore majoring in American history here at the Air Force Academy. And my presentation today is Silence in the Early Hours of 16 April 1746, the Glorious Revolution's Effect on Scotland and the Aftermath of the Jacobite Rebellions. Okay. So essentially what I was trying to figure out was which event actually prompted the end of like traditional Highlander life and like all the restrictions that followed and whatnot. So I was looking at two different events. The Battle of Culloden in 1746, which is what many historians will consider the actual event that prompted it, versus the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which is the one that I actually believe is the one that caused all these restrictions. So in order to understand this whole concept, we have to go back about a century, or well, technically 2 centuries, to look at like how the succession worked. So we start with the House of Tudor and Elizabeth I. She's known as the Virgin Queen. She never had children, was never married. And after her death, the throne of England was passed on to James VI of Scotland, who I believe was her cousin. And he became James VI of Scotland and first of England. So that's why it's 6-1 right there. After his death, it went to his son, Charles I. And Charles I was actually beheaded for treason. Basically, they determined that he was pursuing personal interests instead of the good of the country overall. And due to his beheading, the Commonwealth actually took over. So that was run by Oliver Cromwell. He actually was a general who led armies against Charles I in the English Civil Wars. And these were all mostly over religious freedom, amongst other things. So we basically get the royalists versus the parliamentarians, and of course, the parliamentarians ended up winning that one. So next up, we have Charles II, who was Charles I's oldest son, who survived infancy. And Charles II, he ended up just having a normal reign in life and everything. And then after his death, it went on to James VII and II. So next up, we'll look specifically at James VII and II. I promise there's a reason I'm going through all this. So his first wife was Anne Hyde, and both of them were Protestant when they got married, specifically Anglican. And eventually Anne Hyde decided that she would convert to Catholicism. Later on, after she converted, James VII converted as well to Catholicism. And so when he did that, they also had their two daughters who survived infancy, specifically Mary and Anne. And what happened with them is they were both raised Protestant. The reason for this is during Charles II's reign, he insisted that they be raised Protestant because he didn't want a bunch of Catholics running the English throne. So they ended up raising them Protestant. After Anne Hyde died a couple years later, James ended up marrying Mary of Modena, who was 25 years younger than him. He ended up proposing to her when she was 11. They got married when she was 15. And they had 7 children, 2 of which survived infancy. And their son ended up being born in 1688, and he ended up being Catholic. So, of course, this starts sparking a lot more of the Catholic versus Protestant issues. And the Protestants in the English Parliament were not entirely thrilled with this. So what they ended up doing, there were 7 English noblemen who later became known as the Immortal Seven. And they basically wrote a document to William of Orange, who was James II's, his daughter, Mary's husband. And it was basically telling him, hey, we want you to be on the throne. We don't want James. We don't want any more Catholics on the throne. So that's what sparked the Glorious Revolution of 1688. It was William of Orange and the Immortal Seven and the armies basically invading and the monarchy. And then James II, his wife, and their son, they ended up fleeing over to France, and there they took refuge. So this basically marks the beginning of the end, as I like to call it. First off, we have the Toleration Act of 1689, and all of these took place under William and Mary. They were the first dual monarchs to reign in England. And the Toleration Act of 1689 basically was a takeoff of James II's Declaration of Indulgence in 1687. His Declaration of Indulgence had given religious freedom to pretty much everybody. By the time the Toleration Act came around, they modified it more or less. So it was religious freedom for Protestant nonconformists, meaning basically if you were Jewish, Catholic, atheist, anything else, you weren't given the same freedom. Furthermore, the Land Tax Acts of 1694, 95, and 98, those were used to fund the Army and the Navy. And keep in mind, this is the same army, now that Scotland and England are kind of joined together, that would go in and kind of monitor Scotland and make sure nothing was going to go on over there. And then you have the Act of Settlement from 1700. The Act of Settlement is actually still in play today. It basically states that anybody of the Popish religion, aka the Catholics, are not allowed to sit on the throne of England. So hence why we still have the House of Hanover, who took over after the death of William and Mary in 1714. And that is where Elizabeth II, who is currently sitting on the throne, comes from. So to start out, what is a Jacobite? Pretty simple. Jacobite derives from the Latin term Jacobus, which is the Latin name for James. And it's basically anybody that is supportive of the House of Stuart, which is James' bloodline that took over after Elizabeth I. So our first of the main Jacobite rebellions is known as the 15. It took place from 1715 to 1716. And it was known as Mar's Rebellion because it was led by John Erskine, the 6th Earl of Mar. This was probably the largest army out of all of the Jacobite rebellions, as it started out with 20,000, though technically only about 2,500 were actually considered warriors. The rest of them basically just brought pitchforks and whatever else they had available to fight off muskets. So at least they had the effort and intent to be there. Unfortunately, because John Erskine decided to sit on attacking the British, this allowed the British time to gather reinforcements, and they ended up defeating Mar's Rebellion. So, the second of the Jacobite rebellions is known as the 19. It took place in 1719, and it was only one battle, which was the Battle of Glen Shiel. This was the shortest of the three, obviously. It was the last engagement to take place on British soil. And in this case, the Jacobites did have Spanish assistance this time, though not very much, and it ended up not really being very effective anyway. And then thirdly, we have the 45. This one's the most glorified and well-known of the three rebellions. It took place 1745 to 46. And in this case, it was actually James II's seventh grandson who was leading it. They call everyone in Scotland was calling him Bonnie Prince Charlie because he was basically the poster child of the day. And then so this one started out with about 14,000 Jacobites. And unfortunately, while they had started out with 4 or 5 really, really good battles and wins, they ended up not doing too well later on. They ended up with only about 5,000 by April 1746. The French did lend some support for the final battle of Culloden. Unfortunately, the French were also dealing with their own issues in other countries at that time, so they couldn't lend too much support for this. And of course, Bonnie Prince Charlie's army ended up going against William Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland, at the Battle of Culloden. This ended up being the detrimental battle for the Jacobites because they ended up with 1,000 to 1,500 casualties versus the English only losing 50 men. So it was literally like bringing broadswords to a cannon fight. It was very detrimental for the cause. So in the aftermath, we have the Disarming Act of 1746. Not only were they no longer allowed for the next 7 years to have muskets or rifles or broadswords, they also were not allowed to wear their clan tartans because they weren't allowed to have that distinction of where they belonged as far as clans go. And they also were not allowed to have bagpipes for this 7-year period. The reason for this is during the war, the bagpipers didn't carry weapons. They were just there to play the bagpipes, and the government needed a reason to arrest them. So they said, well, you're carrying an instrument of war because that's basically your rally cry. So we're going to take your bagpipes from you. The Heritable Jurisdictions Act followed after that. Because the king and parliament now owned all of Scotland's land, the clan chieftains no longer had control over the tenants and everyone. So this Heritable Jurisdictions Act gave Parliament the ability to collect taxes from the tenants instead of the clan chieftains doing it. So in conclusion, I believe it was actually the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which caused all of the restrictions to start on the Scottish Highlanders. The Battle of Culloden was more of just a final hurrah and like a way for them to actually just end up ending the whole attempt to try to put the House of Stuart back on the throne. for those of you who have seen the well-known TV show Outlander, hopefully this cleared up some of the confusion with any part in the show. Any questions?
Thank you so much. Yeah, and any questions, go ahead and start putting those in the chat. So I'll start us off. You do seem to have like one of the oldest topics of this group of presentations, just in terms, but I do think there's probably still some repercussions today. Do you see this having any bearing on Scotland's continued renewal of a possible decision to leave the United Kingdom?
So personally, I don't see much of an issue with it because a lot of it was based on religion at the time. So like you have the Catholics over in Scotland and Episcopalians, and then you have your Protestants over in England. And really, we don't really pay too much attention to that anymore. The act that basically is still in play today with like the Popish religion and everything. I mean, it doesn't really apply too much anymore, but it's just still there because they just really haven't had a reason to get rid of it. But yeah, personally, I don't believe that there's really going to be many uprisings in the future, if any. So.
All right, so we do have a question here. What do you think leads other historians to agree on the battle opposite to your conclusion as to what was responsible?
I believe that other historians would probably believe that just because like they were still putting in the effort to keep trying to win these battles, and like the one prior to that was back in 1719, so they were still thinking about this stuff 30 years later. The only problem is now you have basically the last heir, who was Bonnie Prince Charlie, trying to lead it, and that ended up failing even. So there was really no point to continuing the efforts after that.
Any other questions? So I guess another one I have is knowing, see, I learned about the Glorious Revolution when I was studying in England. And very much the way they characterized it as part of their history was that it was this great thing that happened because it was a bloodless revolution. So did you see a lot of disparity in terms of your sources, in terms of how they depicted that as either being something that was really a quite violent, albeit bloodlessly violent, towards Catholics in Scotland, as opposed to how British sources were depicting that revolution?
No, so everything said that it was bloodless, and yeah, obviously nobody died. It was just mostly, it was more of a I can't think of the term right now, but just trying to say, okay, I have an army and I'm not afraid to use it type thing. So either get off the throne or bad things are going to happen. So in that case, it was more just like them trying to do the whole like threat.
Yeah.
But Scotland didn't really have anything further on that I could see. It was just more the aftermath of it.
Interesting. And you brought up Outlander, which is an interesting example of how we've kind of romanticized this period of Scottish history. But I mean, you even see that romanticism by the time, you know, when Balmoral Castle is established by Victoria and Albert during the Victorian era. Is there a reason that it seems like even Britain's perception of Scotland, or England's perception of Scotland, has changed from something where they saw them as violent and in need of that kind of threatening suppression to something that was sort of romantic and bygone?
I think that in that case, it's more just the personal view of the author who wrote Outlander. And of course, you have like the whole backstory of it and everything. And that TV show was kind of my inspiration for doing this whole research project, just because I couldn't think of anything else at the time I wrote the paper. But it was definitely interesting, like looking up and seeing, okay, they actually kind of got that right versus that was wrong. Why did you guys do that type stuff? So, yeah, I did that kind of answer your question.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it was so much like England's view of it. I think it was just what the author wanted to write about, and it ended up being pretty close, relatively speaking. So.
Well, and within the show, and I have not seen the show or actually read the book, but is there a great deal of emphasis placed on that battle? Is basically, because I know it's a time travel show, that battle being the turning point of when things really started to go south for the clans in Scotland?
Oh yeah, so basically the entire second season is the build up to the battle. So it basically plays a huge role in like the first couple seasons of the show.
Cool. Thank you. Well, does anyone else have any other questions?
Looks like there's one more. Or no, never mind.
All right. Well, if not, thank you so much, Abigail, for your presentation, for these great answers. Thank you all for your wonderful presentations. Applause to all of you. And yeah, enjoy the rest of CSURF and the rest of your day.
Thank you for hosting us.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here.